And so Freud's personality development, because remember, the personality, self, social self are all the same thing. Personality is kind of a psychological term, but then the sense of self or social self is the idea of sociology, and it's the idea that your personality is dependent upon your social interaction with other people. It's not something you're born with. But yet Freud is important. Even though he was a psychiatrist and not a sociologist, he was important because he was one of the first persons to write in such a way as to try to bridge this gap between nature and nurture. The debate going on about, are we born with certain personality traits, or is it all a result of socialization? Freud kind of bridged that. So it didn't have to be one or the other. It could be a combination of both. And that bridge is seen in this interplay between the id, the ego, and the superego. So let's look at those three things. All right. The id is Latin for it. It's the it factor. Now, we didn't go over this at all, right? Okay. The id. Whatever part of our personality is biological, that part is the id. So this is that part. The id refers to the basic human desires or the human drives that you're born with. So the id, you might want to write it down this way as well. The id is complete self-centeredness. Let's see, that may be up there. Complete self-centeredness. And so when you're born, the only thing that you have personality-wise is really the id, selfishness, which means that the most selfish person in all the world is a newborn baby. All right? We look at them as being nice and innocent, but in reality, they're just a bundle of id. They don't care what you're doing. When they're hungry, they want to eat. And they want to eat right then. They don't care how long you've been up or how long you haven't been asleep. Right? Anybody have kids? You can testify this? Yeah, they're going to, my younger brother, bless his heart, that's the way of saying I'm about to say something bad, right? He and his wife, when they had their first baby, they were going to have the perfect child, because that's how all first-time parents are. And so they bought books on how to raise children, and one of the books they bought was on how you'll know when you're supposed to feed your child. And I'm thinking, because by that time we'd already had a couple of children. I'm thinking, that child will let you know when it wants to eat. There'll be no confusion, right? They'll cry until that's the id. Now, there's basically 4 human drives. Now, this is more from me than Freud, but there's basically 4 human drives that I think make up the id in some way or another. And by human drive, these are physical desires that have got to be met, or else you will die or society will cease to exist. Okay, so this is kind of what makes up the id. In and of themselves, they're not bad. It's part of being a human. But basically, hunger, so you got to eat, right? If you don't eat, you'll die. Drink. You can live longer without food than you can water. So you got to drink. Sleep. You have to sleep, not during class, but you got to sleep sometime. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture, right? If you don't get sleep, eventually you'll die. And then the 4th one, believe it or not, you will not die. But if somebody somewhere doesn't have sex, society will cease to exist. Now, you won't die if you don't have sex, but society will. You see. All right? I know that's hard to believe. All right? So you've got these 4 physical drives that kind of make up the id. Now, if you live your entire life where you base everything you do solely on those 4 physical drives, you will be a miserable person, and if all society did that, society would be horrible as well. If we lived our entire life based on, all we wanted to do was satisfy our hunger, well, then we become gluttons, and that's not healthy for you as an individual or a society as a whole, right? You follow me? If you live your entire life, all you want to do is satisfy your desire to drink, well, then you become a drunken. There's drunkenness. Sleep becomes laziness. And then sex becomes immorality. And all 4 of those things, even though they are good, and you got to have them, when they're abused, they become a negative for individuals and for society as a whole. Right? And so as a result of that, even though you're born with the id, and again, children are the most selfish creatures on earth, especially a newborn child. You don't have to teach a child to share. I mean, you don't have to teach a child to be selfish. You got to teach them to share, right? Because they're selfish by nature. You don't see parents chasing around infants saying yes, 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 yes. They're following them saying no, 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 no. And so a child's first words most often than not is no. It's not mommy and daddy. Mommy and daddy want it to be mommy and daddy, but it's no because that's the word they hear the most. And so very, very quickly then society starts to try to temper the id. All right. Now that tempering of the id is called the superego, which we'll look at in just a second. But the second part of his personality then is the ego. And the ego is a person's conscious efforts to balance the innate pleasure-seeking drives with the demands of society. The word ego is I. It's the Latin word for I. Now hear this, because a lot of people, this is something I think is why a lot of people get confused with Freud. In our terminology, if we say somebody has an ego, that's usually a bad thing, right? We're saying they're full of themselves, they're haughty. But that's not Freud's term. An ego is good. We all have an ego. The job or the goal is to have a healthy I, a healthy sense of self, a healthy ego. So in Freud's terminology, an ego is a good thing. Right? So the ego then, however, is... I'm sorry. I'll write it down in a second. So the ego is I, and this is the strong sense of I. The superego, and then I'll explain it. It's easier this way. The superego, the word superego is Latin. Ego means I. The prefix super means above or beyond or outside of. And so this is something that's coming from above the I or outside the I. So it refers to the culture within an individual. The cultural demands that people place on, that society places on individuals. That's the superego. So it works like this. Right? So the superego is culture-centered or other-centered. Whatever is the opposite of the id, that's the superego, okay? So the job of the ego is to balance the demands of the id with the demands of society. So the id is it that's other-centered or self-centered. The superego is above the I, that's other-centered or culture-centered. And then the ego is a balanced centeredness. Now here's how it works. Do you know anybody who's in their 20s? They're not in this room, okay, so that would let everybody off the hook, all right? But somebody in their 20s who is still self-centered and they think the whole world revolves around them? Yeah, all right? Now, do you know anybody in their 20s, okay, who they are almost hamstring or handcuffed because they get on your nerves as well because they cannot make a decision on their own to save their life. They're not going to do anything until they find out what everybody else is going to do. And they operate out of fear because they're so afraid they're going to hurt somebody's feelings or make somebody mad. And so they can't do anything until they find out what everybody else is going to do. Right? That's a person whose ego is operating under the superego. They're so concerned with what other people think, they can't do anything on their own. On the other end are people who are still self-centered, so they come in late and say, that's me, and it's because everything operates around them, you see. Right? All right? Yeah. Amber?
Is that kind of like having like a little bit more of anger?
No, not really. That might be more of Kohlberg when we get to him. But basically, here's how, if you want to draw it out, this is why I left the screen up. You draw it out on a line like this. Okay, the ego or the id and the superego, they are extremes. This is complete and utter selfishness. This is complete and utter otherness or culturedness. No, they don't. No, I mean, because the society says go kill somebody, they'll go kill them. No, so it's not passive. It's I'm not going to do anything until I find out what society says. Everything is what society says to do. I've never had an original thought in my life. I don't, what's going on today?
Would shy people be considered under the superego? Who are so typically very...
It may be a result. It may be a result of that. But it could be. But it could be, that's how they get their way too. All right? Now, the job of the ego is to try to balance these two. Okay? And so a person who is still an adult and they're extremely selfish and self-centered, they have an ego. It's just out of balance over here, and that's unhealthy. That is unhealthy. Okay? But just as unhealthy is a person who they're so afraid they're going to hurt other people's feelings, or they're so afraid they're going to do something, quote, wrong, that they hardly ever act at all. Their ego is out of balance over here, and that's just as unhealthy as over here. Does it make any sense? The problem is society has a way of negatively sanctioning this person. In other words, that selfish person is either going to have a very, very difficult life and have very, very few friends, or eventually they get a clue that it's not about them and they balance out. Now, they may be in their 80s before they get that clue, but eventually they get that clue that you cannot spend your entire life only concerned with yourself and what you want. The problem is, on the other side here, this is unhealthy also. But while society has a way of punishing this ego, society has a way of rewarding this ego. And so in a sense, this is even more unhealthy. And the example that I give is there's a couple of examples, but one would be, our society puts a high premium on success. Success is based on, how much stuff you have, basically. And our society says you've got to work hard. You've got to work for everything you get. Honest day's work for an honest day's pay, right? You follow me so far? And so a person who's fed up or who is filled up with a superego, they become a workaholic. All right? They work, 100 hours a week, and all they do is work because they're giving into the superego. You got to work hard. Now, what does society do? Society rewards them with all kinds of money, all kinds of positions in life. But those people are out of balance. They ruin their families. They wreck their marriage. They don't know their kids' names. But boy, they're successful. Or a person who volunteers their time, because everybody needs to volunteer. You need to give your time away and give back to the community. But there are some people who will volunteer so much time that they don't go to their kids' athletic events or they don't go to their kids' music event. They're always volunteering, and they're neglecting everything else in life, their family and everything else, because they're volunteering all the time. And what happens? They get Volunteer of the Year. So society has a way of rewarding this, punishing this. The job of the ego is to try to bring about a balance between this. Now, here's an example using my son. My son is 16, so he's almost out of this stage, somewhat, but more in the junior high age. The following conversation would take place almost every day after school. He'd come home from school, go upstairs, maybe change clothes, sit down, watch television, chill out for a little bit, maybe play a video game. But not very long into the process of being home, he would come downstairs into the kitchen. Now, it's a traditional family, so my wife's in the kitchen. She likes to cook. I like to eat. It's a win-win, all right? So he would come downstairs almost every day, and he would say this, "Mom, I'm about to starve to death." Statement. Right? It's complete selfishness. What he's saying is, if I don't get something to eat right now, I'm hungry. If I don't get something to eat right now, I'm going to die, and it's going to be your fault. Now, in reality, is he going to die if he doesn't get something to eat right then? No, he probably had something this morning. It takes a long time to die of starvation. It's not going to happen. It's an id statement. Now, my wife, his mom, would represent the superego. Because she's society. And so she looks at him and says, "Zach, I believe you'll be okay. You're not going to die. I'm cooking supper. We'll eat in a little while. Go back upstairs. Or if you're really, really hungry, here's a banana. Something healthy." All right, so you got the id, I got to eat right now, I'm going to die. And you got superego saying, you're not going to eat right now. And you'll be okay. Now the ego in my son's got to decide what's he going to do with this. He could get on the floor, lay on his back, kick and scream his legs, and make a big fit. I got to have something to eat right now. It's all your fault. You're ruining my life. You guys never take care of me. Now, is there anybody here who thinks that a 13-year-old who does that is healthy? No. But you still see people throw temper tantrums when they don't get their way. On the other hand, he could, go up to the room, thinking, man, society sucks. I never get to do anything I want to do. I don't know if I'll ever get there. I might as well make out my will. I don't know if I'll ever eat again. Well, that's not healthy either. I mean, that healthy ego says, okay, I think I can make it. I'll go upstairs. If I go upstairs and get really involved in something, I'll forget how hungry I am. And when it's time to eat, I'll be first in line. A healthy ego. And because you see, that we all face those things. I mean, this morning, because it's Monday, your alarm went off. The id said, go back to sleep. You're more important than... All right. The superego kicked in and said, yeah, but you know what? I mean, you paid some money for class, and society's going to think you're a bum, and so the ego's got to decide, what am I going to do? And at least looks like most of you decided to do the right thing. Healthy ego. Now, there could come a day when you wake up and you are sick, I mean physically sick, and it's been and you're just exhausted, that the healthy ego says what? I don't care what society says, today I've got to stay home and rest. You see. But if that's what the ego says every day, that's a bad ego. If on the other hand, the ego says you got to get up and go regardless of how you feel, because let me just tell you, if you've got the flu, please stay home, because I don't want to get sick. I mean, my wife was really bad about this. She used to so bad at the end of the year in the school year. They have the awards programs at school, especially in elementary school, and they give out these certificates to these people with perfect attendance. And my wife always wanted to go up to their parents and say, you're the reason my child got sick. Because you sent your kid to school with 104 temperature. So I mean, there comes a time when does that make sense? It's a balanced ego. You cannot always give in to your selfish desires. But you do got to take care of yourself. And you can't always give in to what society says. But we do have these norms and rules that you're supposed to live by. And then the ego finds a balance. Now, when it finds a balance, the word that defines the balance that the ego strikes is sublimation. It's right there in the crook. I think I'm done with the boards. I can put it down there. But sublimation, this should be superego, not ego. Sublimation is the compromise between self and society. The best example of sublimation is marriage and family, or at least marriage. And here's how it works. The id says, I want to go out there and have sex. I got to fulfill that desire. Because remember, Freud is psychosexual. So I got to fulfill that desire. There is no society in the world anywhere that says it is acceptable to have sex at any time, any place, with anyone. Every society regulates it. And in most societies, sexual activity is regulated with marriage, through some form of marriage. And so marriage is the compromise between what society says you can do appropriately and what your physical desire, your id, says you want to do. Does that make sense? That's sublimation. So in a sense, going to college is sublimation between the id saying, I just want to be lazy, and society saying you got to be a success. The sublimation is, okay, I'll go to college, get a degree, get a better job. So sublimation is that word that talks about the compromise between the id and the superego. But the id and the superego are at constant odds with each other as we go through 4 or 5 stages. Now, Freud gets a bad rap, and I already mentioned that he's somewhat psychosexual. So Freud gets a bad rap because he thinks everything was about sex, or that's what people said. It's actually not sex as much as it's pleasure and pain. And so his 5 stages, at each stage, the id, the ego, and the superego are at work, developing your personality. Right? But these stages are determined by what part of your body you're experiencing pleasure and pain in. Okay? And so that's why they're called what they are. The first stage he calls the oral stage, which is the mouth. Now this is birth to about age 1. All these people we're going to look at have these stages, and then they have, age, once you reach this age. This does not mean that once you're 1 year and 1 day old, you're automatically in the next stage. This is generally speaking, these are kind of the broad categories of when people are in this stage, but people develop differently. But within reason, this is what it is. So the oral stage. Now, if it's about pain and pleasure, this first stage is the oral stage, so we are receiving pleasure through the mouth. If that's the case, who is the most important person in a child's life? Why? The breastfeeding. Especially if you put it in Freud's day where there wasn't a whole lot of stuff that we had today or through formula, or even guys can put on this thing that gives them a breast that they can feed. Have you seen that? It's like a bottle that so the guy can have that bonding experience with his with his newborn. But in Freud's day, it was pretty much the mom. This is why when you see a Freudian psychologist, eventually they're going to ask you the question, tell me about your relationship with your mom. Because the mom is the first and most important person in a person's life. The oral stage, and so through feeding. But it's not just feeding. An infant, the moment they can reach and grab stuff, where do they put it? And everything they grab goes to the mouth, because an infant is learning everything about the world through the mouth. This is the oral stage. So whatever you grab, you put it in your mouth, you're learning about your environment. Psychoanalysis says you don't ever forget anything. Every memory you have, everything that you've ever experienced is in your brain somewhere. And so as an infant, everything you touch, you put in your mouth. 22 years later, you're at a friend's house or you're at a restaurant, you take a bite of something, you make an ugly face, and you say, this tastes like crap. What's the obvious question? How do you know what crap tastes like? Well, now you know the answer. Apparently, you put that in your mouth at this stage. You forgot about it, but it's in your subconscious. 22 years later, you eat something, and boom, it brings it right. That's what this tastes like dirt. This tastes like tree bark. This tastes like bugs. Well, apparently, you put all that stuff in your mouth. And that's how you learned about your environment. So the oral stage. The second stage is the anal stage, which is now the midsection. So now this region of pleasure has moved from the mouth to the midsection. And here's how it works. If you have children, you know this. If you have a child between the ages of 1 and 3, you've got one goal for that child and one goal only. And what is it? Potty train. And so now all the attention moves to the child's midsection. So that's where the area of pleasure and pain resides. And then we bribe our kids. We tell them, if you shoot the Cheerios in the bowl, you'll get big boy underwear. And then we have commercials. I'm a big kid now. We tell our daughters, if you go potty, we'll buy you big girl panties. Now, if they're 18 years old and you say big girl panties, that has an entirely different meaning. You see. So all this pressure now is put on this midsection. People, they find pleasure in it, or they get abused if they have an accident, so there's pain. And then when the child does learn to go potty, I'll use, it's happened with guys too, but I'll use girls also. I'll use a church illustration. You have these 3-year-old girls walking around church in their nice dresses, and they've just learned to go potty, and so they got on these new panties. And what do they do at church? Look at my panties. Look at my big girl, Now, if they're 16 and they're doing that, you got problems. Right? But so all the attention, the child's entire life is centered on that part of the body. So many, many people who are abused sexually, that sexual abuse happens at this stage for the very first time. Because there's so much attention given to that part of the body. All right? So that's the anal stage. The third stage is the phallic stage. Now, a lot of stuff happens at this stage, ages 3 to 5. But the one thing that he writes a lot about, and what most people say, is that during this stage, between 3 and 5, is what Freud called the Oedipus conflict. Has anybody heard of that? All right. Yeah, it's based on Oedipus Rex, a figure in Greek mythology who, in a weird fate, falls in love with his mom and they have a child. He doesn't know it's his mom at the time, but anyway. So basically what Freud says is that, now Freud studied boys and males, and so you got to kind of jump to say the same thing happens with girls. But with males, between the ages of 3 and 5, the son sees his mother as a sex object. All right? Now you're thinking, if you're a son, there's no way I did that. Well, let me challenge that. Okay? Now obviously a son, he's 3, 4, 5 years old, doesn't realize that, I want to have sex with my mom. But that's what Freud's saying. He sees his mom as a sex object, and here's how it works. And when my son was in this stage, it's really quite amazing. I could come in from work. He could be in the far end of the house, not even know I'm there. And if I got close to my wife, his mom, you tell me what happened. I mean, he comes out of nowhere. Got a radar, gets between me and his mom, and says, no, my mommy. Right? And then may even go as far as saying, when I grow up, I'm going to marry my mommy. You see. And it's not just the husband. I mean, it could be anywhere. If a guy gets to, it could be granddad, it could be a friend, all of a sudden the boy appears out of nowhere. All right. Now, here's what's going on, at least from Freud's perspective. The son is seeing the mom as a sex object. At the same time, he sees the dad, or the male in the house, as competition. And so the id wants to kill the dad. All right. But at the same time, he's seeing the dad as the competition and secretly wants to kill the dad. He is also seeing the dad as an example. He's watching the dad to see what does the dad do to get the mom's attention. All right? Now, this is incredibly important, because if that son sees the dad or the male in the house physically abusing the mom, then what's the child learning? Yeah, the way you get the woman's attention is through physical abuse. And so most people who abuse their spouses, they were either abused as well as a kid, or they saw their dad abuse mom. Okay? Now on the other hand, if the son sees the dad treating the mom with respect and dignity and all that kind of stuff, then they're learning that as well. Now Freud said another thing happens during this stage that you really got to put in his context to understand it, because this is the early 1900s. In that day and time, homosexuality was seen as a mental disorder and all that. But Freud said somehow or another, the resolution of the Oedipus conflict in a child, how that's resolved, sets the stage for what that child's sexual orientation will be at a later stage in life. So you're not born with sexual orientation. It's set somehow or another through the resolution of the Oedipus conflict. All right? So the phallic stage.
They say a man usually marries a woman that's going to be similar to their mother.
Well, it would find its roots in that, yeah.
So what do you mean by how that works out, determines if the child's going to be homosexual?
Well, you have to read more of Freud on that. But it also determines they're heterosexual, you see. See, when we talk about sexual orientation, we come back to this. We've got to be really, really careful of saying that you're born one way, but you're not born another way, you know. And so, so you're either born either way or you're not born either way, at least in my thinking. Does that make sense? In order to be consistent. But so somehow I think, from Freud's perspective, the norm, most people will be heterosexual. That's the norm. But that's because in most cases that Oedipus conflict is resolved in the norm of that society. But in some cases then, if maybe there's an absence of a dad at all, or it could be because of abuse, or it could be because of an over-nurturing mom. I mean, there could be a lot of different things that are going into play there, but somehow or another, through that Oedipus conflict, the sexual orientation is set on a child. You know, Freud, I didn't read everything he wrote, and so, I mean, you have to really, but I think part of the thing you got to realize is the time because he would have seen, I think I'm safe in saying he would have seen homosexuality as being an abnormal resolution to that conflict. Whereas today, most psychologists would not say that. They don't want to say that any sexual orientation is an abnormality. You know, but Freud was writing in a different day.
So sexual orientation is not abnormality, or just say it's
That's what most psychologists would say today. Yeah, it's gone from being a mental disorder to just simply being one of many different sexual orientations, and one is no more harmful or helpful than any other one. Is how most people would see it today. Yes. You had a question?
Yeah, I feel
You forgot it? All right. Tell those little men in your head. Go find it. As soon as you bring it up to me, I'll raise my hand again.
All my kids act like that. So I have 3 boys. They all act like that.
Act like what?
They all, love on me. Like, my oldest is 11, and I have 8 years.
Well, Freud would say that's a normal response. I mean, because all boys do that.
Well, my 5-year-old, he's taking it to extreme sometimes. So I'll be telling him, fight him back.
Yeah.
So that's
Well, let me see him. I'll lay him down on the couch. Tell me about your relationship with your mom, and we'll get into it. All right? Yeah. Yeah. Now, well, since you said that, if you go back to the anal stage, it's at this stage also where boys and girls start learning the difference. Like, it's quite common for kids, ages 1 and 2 or whatever. They all take a bath together if they're family members. About the time they get 3 and 4 and they start moving from one to the other and they start noticing the different plumbing, it's like, we got to stop. Yeah, and part of the reason they start to notice it is because of all the attention that's placed on that part of the body through potty training. Up until that time, I mean, you just lay on your back and they changed you. Now all of a sudden, this emphasis on that part of the body, they start to notice, and it could become, they're too old, right? I mean, if you live in a family and you got 7 and 8-year-old brothers and sisters still taking a bath together, that's a problem, okay?
Yeah, I thought my little girl was
Sorry.
messed up in the head or something. She was like 3. Like, we go in the bathroom somewhere together. She go use the bathroom, and I let her go there and wash her hands, and then I go use the bathroom, and my back be up. And she be doing me like this, trying to see how I'm standing up.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
It's weird, man, because I be telling her,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's how she's learning. So she's not weird. At least she may be weird, but that's not the reason. But, I mean, well, see, the thing is also, I mean, the same thing is, parents will take their children, even if it's the opposite sex child, they'll take their children into a public restroom together up until they reach a certain age, and it's usually, there may be some people out of necessity, they may have to take a 6 or 7-year-old in, but usually by the time they're out of that phallic stage, for a lot of people it stops around the age 3 or 4, but then, for some people it may be they get on the 5 or 6, that's a difficult thing. If like you're a single parent and you have a daughter or you have a son, and now you're at a restroom and you're thinking, okay, I'm going to let them go in there by themselves, and then you got all kinds of concerns that are going on. Well, that's usually what happens. It seems like it's okay for the women's restroom because they all have stalls. Men, we're pigs. We don't have. Those old-timey restrooms for guys were just a trough. You remember those? It's just, no wonder we're pigs. You treat us like that growing up. Well, you have to jump. I don't know. I think to a degree it is because a lot of girls in this age become daddy's girls. But it's a jump because Freud was basing his research on boys. But there may be a degree to where that happens. But I don't remember my daughter like getting between us and saying, no, my daddy, the same way that my son would get. She may have, but I don't remember it being as bad. But at the same time, daughters become very, very close to their dads during that age.
Yeah, like my daughter, she was like 3 or 4. Because we're our kids are dads. So then we have to sometimes, like, she's like, give me a kiss. She won't kiss her. She's like, hey, he's like,
Yeah.
you can't kiss me like that.
Yeah. So there could be. I mean, my daughter, when she got potty trained, I felt comfortable taking her with places by myself. Then, and so like when she was 3 or 4 years old, I used to do a lot of summer camps during the summer. And when she was 3 or 4, she started going with me to all those. Mom would stay at home with the baby, and she'd go with me during this stage. And so to this day, I think she still tells you she's a daddy's girl because we spent a lot of time together.
So you didn't change pampers either?
At that, I did every once in a while. Every once in a while, But anyway, that's another story. All right. The latency stage. All right. At the latency stage, the word latent kind of carries the idea of rest. or calming down. And so the idea is, up until then, everything's kind of been psychosexual. During the latency stage, those sexual feelings kind of go away. They take a rest. Because what's going on in a child during the ages of 5 and 12? That's the schooling. And so cognitive development takes the place here. And so the sexual stuff goes away. Girls got cooties when you're in elementary school. All right, so it kind of goes away. And so the emphasis is on cognitive development. And then the 5th stage is the genital stage, which is when all those hormones kick in again. And it becomes sexual from that point on. And then again, somehow or another, based on what happens at the phallic stage, that could help determine the person's sexual orientation once you get down to this stage. But the key thing to remember is that at each stage, the id, the ego, and the superego are at work, interacting, and the personality is being formed, basically through that sublimation, how the ego balances my selfish desires with the demands of society.